Welcome once again to TLC World. Well, today I've got a very special guest. This is Elaine, my wife, who's going to share with you her journey to Christ. So over to you, Elaine.
Thank you. As the last two messages have focused upon the reality of the existence of both heaven and hell, it's perhaps appropriate that I share my testimony today, as I was blessed to have a personal experience of heaven through a near-death experience on the 24th of October, 1984. However, this was just one step in a journey that ultimately led me to commit to serving Christ to what some might consider an extreme extent. Examples of which are that I gave up a full-time teaching post in a university to work as a church volunteer, and sold the home that was intended to put a roof over our heads after retirement. I tell you these things not only to illustrate how committed I am to Christ, but more as a demonstration of how absolutely convinced I am that there is an afterlife, and that it's vitally important that I spend as much time and energy as possible sharing this with as many people as will listen. The reason for the urgency is that people have to select their final destination whilst they're still alive. Yet unless they're told that death isn't the end and that life continues after death, many will simply assume that life as we know it is all there is. Or, if they believe in an afterlife, they will probably assume that if they're good people or do enough good things, they will go to heaven. The reality is that both positions are wrong. And whilst I can't reach everyone with this news, I want to be sure to share it with as many as I can before I die. So, what happened to me that I could come to such a place? For I would have never seen myself in such a role. I grew up in England in a family that didn't take God into much account, so he never really figured in my life. That said, there was a time in my teens when my life was in danger, and for some reason I lived whilst others in the same situation died. I couldn't explain why, but I sensed that there was something supernatural about my protection. In fact, it was a succession of supernatural experiences that led me to seriously start investigating whether or not there was a God. So let me take you back with me to 1982, and a very unhappy time in my life. In fact, I was so unhappy that I went to see a clairvoyant. My grandmother had been a crystal ball reader, and people talked about her ability to see into the future. But I'd never really been interested in knowing about my future until it looked so very bleak. The clairvoyant, who was a stranger, told me much about my situation, and she told me 3 things that would happen in the future, and all came true within 2 years. Please know that I'm not advocating anyone go to see these people. In fact, I earnestly warn against it, because I have come to know of the supernatural force that is behind the information they receive. And no matter what they say, it doesn't come from God. In fact, God abhors such practices for the very reason that he knows where the information is coming from, and that only hell awaits those who are lured and then snared into such traps by Satan. In time, life improved considerably for me, and in August 1984, I left England for Hong Kong. But in less than 3 months, I was to find myself on the brink of death. The 24th of October 1984 began as any normal day might. But I knew it was going to be special in one way, because I was going to experience my first Chinese dim sum with a group of new friends. However, that evening it became special in a very unexpected way. Without warning, A severe pain shot through my stomach, then another. The pains continued to come, becoming ever more painful. And it wasn't long before I found myself in an ambulance on my way to the hospital. I remember saying to my husband, Jim, that I thought I was dying. And it was not long before that was to happen. All of a sudden, the pain was gone. And instead of being in the hospital, I found myself in a place so wonderful, I really don't have the vocabulary to describe it. It was white, a brilliant white, the kind of white that would hurt your eyes if you were to look at such brightness on earth. I wasn't in my body any longer, but I had all of my senses. I could see, hear, think, and feel, and was acutely aware of what was happening. In this brilliant whiteness, I seemed to be floating on something like a cloud, but so soft that it would make cotton wool feel abrasive. The peace and contentment was greater than anything I've ever experienced on earth. And there was a level of joy and happiness that is hard to describe too. And I wasn't comparing it with an unhappy life, for at the time, my life on earth was immensely happy. I continued to enjoy the experience and wonders of this place, and I remember thinking that if this is heaven, no one need ever be afraid of dying. After some time, I was aware of being given a choice to stay or to go back to the life I knew. And I remember saying, I want to go back to Jim and my 2 young children. And within a flash, I was back. I experienced the searing pain again, but I was soon being whisked into the operating room, for it turned out that I was suffering from an ectopic pregnancy. Later, Jim told me that a nurse had hurriedly approached the doctor he was talking with to report that I had no blood pressure. The doctor simply told Jim to sit, and he watched as a flurry of activity took place. My vital signs were non-existent at that point in time, and I've little doubt that it was during this time that I had my experience of heaven. Later, the doctor came back to tell him that I had been stabilised, and of course I went on to make a full recovery. Maybe I should have started searching for the truth of existence at this point, but I didn't. Almost 2 years were to pass before I was propelled to do so. In April 1986, shortly before we were to return to England for a visit, my father had a heart attack and passed away. I immediately travelled to England, and during my time there, I went to visit friends. They'd actually become Christians, and whilst I thought it a little weird, it did not dampen my feelings for them. During the evening, they shared of their newfound faith, and something strange happened to me, such that when I left their home, although of course I knew I was walking on the ground, it felt as if I was walking on air. I seemed to float home. It was very strange. I really didn't understand what had happened to me, but when I returned to Hong Kong, I decided to go to church to explore more about the faith that my friends had shared. However, I was eventually disappointed by the hypocrisy I found in some and what seemed to be the blind belief of others, for they were never able to answer my questions. I decided that if there was a God, Christianity wasn't the route to him. In fact, I decided to put my search on one side and go back to school and take a degree in psychology and philosophy. Was it just a coincidence that the professor, who was also my personal tutor, turned out to be a committed Christian? I think not, but I wasn't exactly a polite student. For over lunch one day, as we talked about the gospel, I said, How on earth can you believe in such gobbledygook? You have a PhD, for goodness sake. In time, I did apologise. Obviously, I wasn't being allowed to put my search for God on one side. For around the same time in 1989, I had a dream where, out of the blue, I was able to watch the 3-hour interview that my husband was to have the next day. The next morning, I was able to describe the man conducting the interview, to describe what he looked like, give details about his hairstyle, and share that the colour of his suit would be blue. I also saw a second man there, who I could see was in favour of Jim being appointed. Finally, I was able to tell Jim that he would be offered the post. That night, Jim confirmed all the details I'd shared to be true, and said that he'd been offered the position, which was as the head of the management department in the university. At that point, I could have thought myself to be very special, able to see into the future, someone with special powers. But the fact is that I knew that what I'd seen wasn't something I had any control over. It was information that had just been given to me. More than wanting to see myself as someone special, I was more interested in discovering the source of the information. I knew there was a power beyond me, and that if the future could be seen, then it had to be planned by someone or something with power beyond my experience. And this is what really pushed me to begin my search for truth. So began a journey into the spiritual dimension of life. And over the next 4 years, I was to go down many paths, exploring anything and everything that purported to have the answer to my question, did God exist? I explored Buddhism, Islam, and New Age practices such as Raja Yoga, to name just a few. And I found some lovely people and attractive philosophies along the way. But it wasn't long before the pillars of each one I tried to embrace would crumble and fall. And any thoughts that I'd found the truth would just wash away. Not one could stand. My experiences had led me to a point that I could no longer deny that there was a force bigger than man. And it may sound somewhat pretentious, although it wasn't intended to be so. I began to describe myself as a deist, a believer in God, but not in revealed religion. That worked for a time, until more supernatural experiences were to propel my search once again. In 1990, I applied for a post as the English teacher for the Norwegian School of Hong Kong that I somehow knew I would be offered. I won't go into the details of how, as that's a long story in itself. But what I didn't know was that it was actually a Christian school. I came home after my first day and said to Jim, "Can you believe it? I'm surrounded by them." Then, being Christians, they were still not my most respected group of people. However, over time, my wonderful colleagues and students were to give lie to the view of Christians being simply hypocrites or blind believers. In them, I saw Christ reflected in beautiful ways. Shortly after starting work, I did a short course. And when I was given the only Christian in a group of 40 students to be my partner, I had to laugh. In fact, this Christian went on to invite us to join us at her church, an invitation that neither Jim nor I wanted. I politely responded saying, "Maybe one day," but Jim quickly followed it with, "Don't hold your breath." Unbelievably, we actually found ourselves in her church shortly afterwards, because our daughter Kirsty was a brownie, and we'd been invited to join the PAX church service Sunday. Supporting our children was certainly important, so we found ourselves in church once again. The slip of paper I found on my seat in the church invited me to tick a box saying that I wanted to know more about Christianity. And with my view of Christians changed, and having found no answers in all the other religions and philosophies I'd spent years exploring, I ticked the box. Then began almost a year of asking the pastor every question we could fire at him during his weekly visits to our home. He answered many, and he was honest enough to say that he couldn't answer others. But the one thing he never did was ask us to just believe, advice that had frustrated me in the past. However, our questions came to an end, and we suggested his visits were no longer necessary, and that we'd continue searching independently and just visit his church from time to time. It actually took another year before I found the truth for which I'd been searching. On Thursday, the 1st of July, 1993, I shared with my husband just how frustrated I was at not having found the truth, despite having searched for so long. He asked me why it was so important to me, saying that we had a good marriage, great kids, and no money problems. But all I could say is that it was like a piece of me was missing from somewhere deep inside, like a jigsaw puzzle piece, and it was so frustrating. I just wanted to know the truth, but I didn't know where else to look. For hours he listened to me until I reached the point of saying that all of my research pointed to the Christians being right. At that point, I took a deep breath and said that I was going to accept Christianity as the truth, even though I wasn't 100% sure. The next morning, Friday, I felt great. But by Saturday, I was wondering if I was just a little crazy. But nevertheless, on Sunday morning, the 4th of July, 1993, I couldn't wait to go to church, and I rallied my family round to get ready on time. No one could have been more surprised than me when I listened to the sermon being delivered. For out of the mouth of someone I'd never met came chunks of dialogue identical to that I'd shared with my husband just 3 days earlier. It was like listening to myself all over again. I was truly knocked sideways by how much she repeated of my discussion with Jim. Needless to say, when she said that she believed God was speaking to someone in the congregation, I knew it was me. My heart was banging fit to burst, and when she asked for a commitment to be made by coming forward, I hesitated just long enough to hug and say how sorry I was to my husband. I loved him, and I knew that this would take me down a road without him. It was not something that I wanted to do, but it would have been wrong to ignore such a clear call from God. Jim was so understanding, and although that evening he told me that Christianity wasn't for him, the Lord blessed us both when 3 months later he had shown Jim enough for him to make a commitment to. But that's his testimony, so I will say no more. What I will say is that I half expected this newfound faith to crumble away, just as I'd experienced with other faiths in the past. But far from that being the case, God has reinforced more times than I can number that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life that he claims to be. I'm no more special than any other human being that the Lord has created, and I have no doubt that what he's done for me, he will do for you if you are sufficiently interested to find him. You may not have had any supernatural experiences yet, but God doesn't give us all the same experiences, for he expects us to share with each other so that we can discover the magnitude of who he is, and most importantly, receive the eternal life he has to offer. If you are encouraged to seek him, please don't judge Christ as I did in the beginning, by the people you meet. Realize that those who don't do him justice in your eyes are on their own journey with him and may still have much to learn. Instead, judge Christ based on his words. And if you still can't accept his reality, then go on to explore all the historical and archaeological evidence that he has left behind for us to find. He really is good for every word. And in Matthew chapter 7, verse 7, you can read, "Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you." I really encourage you to seek him now, for your eternal destiny really does depend on the decision you make or don't make whilst you're alive. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have been touched by this message in any way and would like to investigate the Christian faith further, please contact us at admin@thelittlecHurchworld.org, and we will be happy to assist you in your investigations. And of course, we're here to help anyone who wishes to give his or her life to Christ. I will say goodbye for now, and God bless you.